The TalkSport Fan Network.
The ultimate on-demand destination for the UK's best fan-led football podcasts.
Want authentic supporter insight on all things Bournemouth? Follow Up the Cherries in all departments on the TalkSport Fan Network.
Club-dedicated content created by the fans, for the fans.
Search TalkSport Fan Network.
Welcome back to episode 2 of This Is Football, and thank you for joining us. Of course, I have got my co-host, Manny, just below. Unfortunately, the camera isn't working at the moment. How are you doing, Manny?
All good, thank you, Craig, and thanks a lot for having me back on. Always a pleasure, and a rather interesting topic you've selected for this week's broadcast.
Yeah, most definitely. And we have got Kate from Leicester Till I Die. How are you doing, Kate?
Yes, I'm really well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, all good, all good. And, of course, we do need to mention our sponsors, Dental on the Banks. Here's a little bit about them now. To find out more about them, visit dentalonthebanks.co.uk. So, this week's topic, we're discussing Leicester City and avoiding that dreaded points deduction that was being mentioned for so long. And the surprise aftermath of it, because I thought that a lot of people would be very, very happy that Leicester weren't getting that points deduction. But some people, come out and said, that Premier League have got it wrong and made mistakes and that Leicester should have. Now, personally, from my perspective, I think it's a great thing because hopefully this will get rid of the profit and sustainability rules. I know that clubs need to spend sensibly and need to be managed in a sensible way. But, Kate, I think Leicester have done that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated and convoluted subject, isn't it? But the bottom line is, for me, is that Leicester broke the rules, if you look at it from a black and white point of view, in just isolation of the 105 million that you can't exceed. But in the small print, which we now know, and I've been banging this drum for a while, you asked Chris, the moment these charges were announced and there was a hint of a grey area, as soon as it got announced and we knew that the EFL couldn't reach us because we hadn't closed the accounting period when they tried to get us, I thought as well that the Premier League wouldn't have been able to claw back what they wanted from us because we weren't in the league when they said that we breached the rules. So I think but the bottom line is, to me, is that it goes to show really that it's very difficult to pursue a dream and beat the odds and beat PSR. It's almost impossible. And what does that say? Which our owner, when he released the statement back in April to say that we are fighting these charges, the key words that he used was to fight for fair sporting competition. And any fan, no matter how angry or biased they are against their own club, I'm really surprised that this hasn't sort of brought a siege mentality for the other 14 clubs outside of the top 6 and not created a siege mentality in that, no, we want fair sporting competition. We want more Leicesters to be able to dream. I think Wrexham are going to find themselves in that position at some point, potentially challenging the big boys. And are they going to be welcome at the table? And everybody wants that. If you get rid of that fair sporting competition, it's all about the money, you've lost the sport.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm just surprised that people haven't been more behind us. Like, stop the backstabbing and the bitching behind the scenes about, oh, well, you've overspent. We haven't really. We've spent money, but you have to stay afloat and to compete in a very, very expensive market. But really, we just made a couple of errors, which then meant we lost a lot of money. And didn't make a couple of big sales in the summers that we needed to, which was our old model. Yuri Tielemans wanted to run down his contract, which was what a lot of it hinged on. It was 40, 50 million quid that would have been half the liability reduced. Yeah. And should you be hung out to dry for that kind of thing when you've clearly tried? I don't know.
I'm completely behind Leicester, and I think it's a great thing that they have escaped this charge. Manny, I want to throw it back to you on the other foot, though, because Everton and Nottingham Forest got points deductions last year. And again, Manchester City seem to be avoiding this. There's all this spotlight on Leicester. There's all this spotlight again on Everton. You know, there's a spotlight on Villa because Villa have upset the status quo. Is it becoming just a close sport? And is that really what, even though the likes of Simon Jordan and people like that say, we don't want that, we want it to be a fair competition, is it a case that they don't want that?
It's hard to say, really, because the more I read about this, Craig, the more it seems to be a case of the legal principle that when there is ambiguity in any kind of contract or directive drawn up, it sort of benefits the party that didn't draft it. And in this case, Leicester have found themselves pretty much benefiting from that. And obviously, as we know, because because Leicester had been relegated to the Championship when their accounting period ended on the 30th of June, it was obviously decided that the Premier League didn't have the jurisdiction to punish the Foxes. So it was more a question of a technicality in many ways. And Kate has nailed it when she said that, clubs have to spend some money. And in addition, there are some other factors like players wanting to run down their deals or other stuff like that, which can sometimes bring about a situation where clubs do end up losing money. And it's not as if, you can easily make that sort of money from, player sales or even merchandise sales or what have you, especially if the club doesn't really do very well. And I'm sure she might agree with me that even when Leicester won the Premiership and were competing in the Champions League and also won the FA Cup, during that wonderful spell when, Leicester were pretty much, the darlings of the Premier League once again, I know how much money, how much revenue was coming in from all of that. And there's only so much that can come in that can possibly help offset all of those costs. So I get what you're saying when you say that PSR might be used as a little bit of a weapon, and especially given how City have so far escaped punishment, it's easy to think that way. But what we're seeing now with Manchester City is that slowly but surely the wheels of justice are starting to turn. They turn slowly, but they do eventually turn. And nobody is saying that we should end up getting our hopes up that they will be stripped of too many of their titles, at least not immediately. But there is a sort of a change in that people are starting to realize that the big clubs shouldn't get to have too much of a say. And I don't know about you, but ever since that whole Super League proposal, a number of these big clubs have started to lose a little bit of credibility. And maybe there seems to be an idea that fans are starting to see through all of that and are saying, you know what? We're not going to allow this league to effectively become a hegemony of the top 6 or so clubs and leave the other clubs, fighting amongst themselves. And that shouldn't be the way at all. I think Kate pretty much alluded to that. But one reason why people are kind of angry about the Leicester situation is that it was effectively done on a bit of a technicality. And there can be no complaints about that. The Premier League pretty much, dropped the ball, and they have to pretty much face the consequences. And the appeal board did say that the rules for PSR were not well drafted at all. So they're going to have to go back and take a look and see where they went wrong. What I would like to see as well is that hopefully maybe other clubs can take a look and see if there are some technicalities that can be exploited. But with Everton and Forest still in the Premier League, I don't know if they have too many grounds for that. But people can start to see through the way the Premier League is conducting itself, all machinations that are going on. And maybe this could lead to the start of things being done, in a more efficient manner without any kind of a controversy. And I do think it's good that the club has won, but the club also has to be humble enough to realize that it was really due to a technicality more than anything else. And the most important thing is that all clubs, big or small, have got to be subject to the rules. That is the only way that this league can become, more credible once again.
But the thing is, Kate, and that was the 2015-2016 season, was such an open Premier League race. It was great for football. It was just great for football that Leicester won it. I'd love to see Bournemouth win it, but if we're not going to win it, I'd like to see somebody else win it. I don't care who that team is, but as long as it's not one of the top six, because it is breaking that status quo and it is breaking that hold of Manchester City, but it is being designed for them. And thinking about this in a little bit more detail, what do the Premier League do now with regards to Everton and Nottingham Forest? Because they can't really award them points for deducting points for last season. They've made a rod for their own back, haven't they?
Yeah, it's quite spectacular that Leicester have been the only ones to properly exploit some of the rules. If they're not properly drafted, and I'll get a quote up in a minute, actually. I've saved it on my phone because it's a real belter from the Premier League, what they said at the time that Forest appealed. And they said at the time that basically, we know it's not legal. We know we've not written it that right, but you kind of know what we meant though, right?
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the punishments that cost tens of millions of pounds and threaten the livelihood of a football club, that most of the football clubs in the Premier League are over a century old, and they don't care about it, it just beggars belief. And they've made a rod for their own back by this court case coming out that the rules aren't properly drafted. So Man City are going to be all over this like a rash. And from what I know about the Everton situation, a lot of the reason why they exceeded the limit was because interest payments on their borrowing against the new stadium were included. Now, infrastructure is supposed to be excluded, but the interest on the loan repayments isn't excluded. Go figure. And obviously the interest rate went whoosh in that year, and their repayments must have gone through the roof, literally, of the new stadium. And that was what was what part of their demise in that sense, really. And Forest, again, how have you not challenged the fact that one of the 3 years they were in the Championship? They were a newly promoted club. And it just beggars belief that the Premier League think that just because they've insinuated kind of what they mean, it should be taken as gospel and you just accept it lying down. And I think that the ironic thing is about this PSR rule is that for Leicester's the top, who owns our club, he's a billionaire many times over. He's richer than the Premier League as a governing body. There's no PSR rules on what you can spend on lawyers' fees. If he thinks he's right, because that's what we've known of Top and our owner, that they'll stand by what they think is right for the benefit of the club. He's done that for years. he will pursue a court case if he thinks he's right and he thinks he's got a good case and he's been advised of such. And there's no limit on how much money he can throw at this court case to prove a point. But yeah, they've made a rod for their own back. It's sad for Everton and Notts Forest for sure, because no one wants to see it. And, you know, a bit like, I always think of it in my head a bit like a double jeopardy. So a goalkeeper can't be sent off for fouling in the penalty area. So do you think you should really be able to punish a club if they've already been relegated? Is that not the punishment? Does double jeopardy not come into it there as well? And with Leicester, when we pursued that Champions League and we'd had that amazing couple of seasons, which was just, the further it gets away from those seasons, the more unbelievable it seems to me, because it will never happen again. But during that period, we attracted better players, which cost more money. Mm-hmm. And you have to keep on. Once you're on that wheel, you almost can't get off. You've got to then sustain that high wages, the good turnover of players. You've got no chance to hire rotten eggs, because if you hire a couple of rotten eggs that don't perform, which is what happened, you can accidentally get relegated. And you've got the 7th highest wage bill in the Premier League that goes into the Championship, which everyone was slagging off. Like, Leicester have got the 7th highest wage bill. Well, yeah, because we finished 5th and 8th. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense that we would have 7th highest wage bill. But you can't do that. You're not welcome at this table. So it's just like a couple of slip-ups. And it's just not fit. Even when the 105 million was put in place, I mean, football inflation, right? If we think about football inflation, what players were paid, say, in Rio Ferdinand's era compared to Erling Haaland now on 650 grand a week? The difference is phenomenal. So why hasn't the PSR limit increased by the same kind of inflation rate? It doesn't make for real value, does it? No. 105 million today gets you a fairly okay player. It's not unusual to hear 100 million price tag being bandied around. It's what the Man City paid for Jack Grealish. 105 million 20 years ago, you'd have got 8 Alan Shearers?
Yeah.
Like, do you know what I mean? It doesn't follow through. And I think that's a lot of what their regulations are about. They don't follow through for fair sporting competition. And I think they've tried to demonstrate that, okay, so if that's the case, can Bournemouth, can Forest, can someone who gets promoted next year, like maybe Luton, can they get into the top 6 fairly and within the rules? And the answer is just always going to be no now.
Richard Masters, Manny, you know my thoughts on Richard Masters. I spoke out about him deducting points off Everton. You know, it was farcical that he deducted them so many points. Then they were given some points back. Then they were deducted more points. Surely he now needs to resign, you know, mainly because it's shown that the rules that he's put in place are completely, you know, null and void, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. He was the one who almost effectively was responsible for that ridiculous contract, and he's pretty much conducted all this business in a haphazard manner. So yes, he should fall on his sword. I completely agree with you. And I also do seem to remember, and Kate can agree with me, that when the Foxes won the Premiership, you know, we were all absolutely delighted for them. But I think one of the reasons why the league that season kind of stuttered is because, you know, they were also a little bit hamstrung financially, that they had to sell quite a few of their assets. I do seem to remember N'Golo Kante going to Chelsea, Riyad Mahrez going to Manchester City, Harry Maguire going to Manchester United, and maybe 1 or 2 more players. So almost effectively, you had a little bit of I wouldn't say the spine, but part of the nucleus ripped out of that team in a way. And obviously, you know, it wasn't going to be easy for Leicester to, you know, repeat that success under those circumstances. And sadly, you know, after a poor run, Ranieri had to leave, although Craig Shakespeare, Lord rest his soul, took up the slack admirably and got Leicester to within, you know, touching distance of a Champions League semi-final, while also saving Leicester's Premier League status. And Kate has also hit the nail on the head in a way when she says that it does look as though any smaller club, or a club that, you know, comes up to the Premier League, will not have an easy chance at all of really doing well and succeeding. And because the deck just seems to be, you know, stacked against them. One thing which will interest me, though, is to see how Aston Villa do this season, because they were also affected by the PSR directives in a way, and that prompted them to have to sell Douglas Luiz and Moussa Diaby, among a few other players. I think they also let a couple of players go to Everton while getting Amadou Onana and I think another bloke from Goodison Park. And they've also been able to spend quite a bit of money getting some players in, and they will be expected to challenge for honours this season. I can see them having a better cup run maybe, and also challenging in the Champions League. Whether or not they'll make the next stage, I'm not too sure. They won't be expected to. But it will be interesting to see how well they do and how well they manage their finances. And if they can do that, then that could be something from which other clubs can maybe learn and get some more people, coming in and just restructuring the club in a way. Because not too long ago, Aston Villa were in the Championship, let's not forget. And how Unai Emery and his new team have taken that club from being a Championship team to a Champions League team in barely a few seasons has been magnificent. Credit also has to go to Dean Smith, who also managed Leicester, I believe. I think, if memory serves me right, he came in after Brendan Rodgers was sacked and had the unenviable job of trying to keep them up, and sadly it didn't quite work out. But in a nutshell, yes, Masters should definitely resign. He should fall on his sword, and I think the Master proved that he is far from being a master. He's actually more of an apprentice, and a pretty poor one at that. And as far as the prospect of other teams possibly challenging for top honours, I think every now and then you will see one middle of the road or smaller team coming up and challenging the big boys every now and then. We saw it with Leicester a few seasons ago. We are seeing it to some extent with Aston Villa. And if that challenge doesn't quite work out, let's also not forget, under Sir Eddie Howe, Newcastle reached the Champions League a couple of seasons ago. Didn't quite work out for them last season in Europe, although they certainly won hearts. So there will be some teams every now and then that will try to upset the order. And that's going to be a more organic sort of process. But invariably, those teams are going to have to make sure that their finances are also well taken care of. And it's not going to be more incumbent on these clubs in question to make sure that they balance their books a lot more frequently and a lot more efficiently, and make sure that everything is done by the book. And now, of course, at Liverpool, Everton's rivals, there's talk about the likes of Mohamed Salah and a few other players not being offered new contracts. And I think Arne Slot has pretty much made it clear that he'd like to build a new team and possibly get rid of some of these high wage earners so that Liverpool can balance their own books. And those are the sort of decisions, really, that can improve the financial health of several clubs in whichever division they may be.
The thing is, though, you've made some good points there, Manny, but, looking at that Leicester team that won the title back in 2016, they sold those players like Riyad Mahrez and Harry Maguire and N'Golo Kante to other clubs. And all of those clubs that they sold those players to were top 6 clubs. Now, the Leicester owners had money to keep those players there. They had the money to pay those salaries. Now, the thing is, with Aston Villa now, of course, if you do well, players want a pay rise. Players will expect and get performance-related bonuses. But the problem is, though, Kate, is that when a team has success, like Villa have and like Leicester have, and when it comes to that point where those bonuses and those pay rises come in, those teams that do well then fall foul of PSR and are having to sell those players to clubs who are kind of breaking the rules, those top 6. And if you've got that money in the bank to pay those players, you should be able to spend it if you want to keep them.
Yeah, that's my big issue with it. I think they have to go back to the drawing board and see why PSR was brought into place in the first place. So we don't want another Bury. We don't want that kind of club that is struggling so much. They owe the revenue so much money. That's kind of liquidation, administration, completely bankrupt. Most of these clubs that are getting punished, they're not bankrupt because they're being bankrolled. But we've got billionaire owners. And weirdly, in a UK friendly environment where you're supposed to be able to pursue and build your own business, Top is not allowed to put money into his own asset. And I find that absolutely bananas. If he owned a property company or an IT company, he could put billions in if he wanted to. It's his money. If it comes from lending or other undesirable sources, it's a different question. You can't leverage a club to the hilt and then expect to not be putting it at such a risk of going under if things fail or you default on your loans. But if you've got hard cash to put into your club, why shouldn't you? And the saying goes, if you've then got it to spend, why shouldn't you spend it? But they've let these stupid transfer figures run away with themselves. And this is kind of catching up with them now. Like 100 million for Grealish. I think they got 65 for Mahrez. We got 35. We got 35 for Kante because it was his release clause. It was a really low release clause because who expected that gem to come out that season? He was unbelievable. Harry Maguire, we got 90 odd. He wasn't part of the Premier League team. He joined the year after, but a massive asset sale. And that's what Leicester's model was. Buy gems, buy them cheap, nurture them and sell them for big money. But when we missed a couple of summers of doing that, we couldn't put our own money in our own hand in our own pocket because you're not allowed to. But 10 years prior, Man City and Chelsea have bankrolled their club, so have the slush in the club, and then the rules came in. And it's just not a level playing field, is it, at all? But I've just found that excerpt that the Premier League said. So this is honestly what they said. It was from the BBC website at the time when Forest had their appeal turned down. And they said decisions such as these should not be subjected to microscopic forensic examination and interpreted as if there were statutes which have been drafted by Parliamentary Council. Allegations of infelicities of language or errors which are not material to the ultimate decision add to the complexity and costs of proceedings and are rarely likely to lead to a successful challenge of a decision. That's what they honestly said. I know our language was a bit crap, but you knew what we meant, right? And it's not really drafted for legal reasons, but we'll fine you tens of millions of quid instead and relegate you.
Yeah. Be honest, I'm impressed you've actually managed to say that all in one go, because I would have stumbled over it about 10 times. It's just
unreal. It's laughable.
Yeah.
So you expect everybody to abide by this, and the penalties are so huge, but they're not really legal or anything. They're not legally binding. And if you put them in front of a judge, they'll probably get thrown out. But people just take it lying down, like the tail wags the dog, doesn't it?
PSR is a big problem in football for me. And Manny, I want to give you a bit of a scenario here. Now, this is a dream scenario. AFC Bournemouth have a fantastic season this year and end up getting into the Champions League places. Now, we've got a number of players who have got performance-related bonuses. So those are paid out by the football club. And we go over PSR. So to actually balance that out, make sure we don't breach, we then have to sell so many players. And the following season, we get relegated. It is not fair. Do you agree with me that model of what PSR is doing and how it is stopping clubs, even if Bill Foley Bill Foley's got that money in the bank, you know, he would be able to pay those bonuses and continue those contracts and have a right go at doing it again. But effectively, this top six, and I know that Arsenal are one of them, and Arsenal, to be perfectly honest, are probably one of the least culprits. Manchester United, Manchester City are probably the big two for me. But that top six, it is just trying to keep the status quo.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And with your scenario in question, you know, I also seem to remember that some clubs in lower divisions also have situations where they end up dropping players for some time because they don't want to run the risk of triggering an automatic extension in their contracts, and they would end up having to, you know, have them on, pay them that money. So you also know about that clause when certain players have a certain number of appearances in the season, it automatically triggers a 1-year extension. That would mean more money being spent in wages or any other kind of bonuses or what have you. So that sort of clause has also been used by several clubs. I believe Blackburn used that when Michel Salgado, the ex-Spain and Real Madrid defender, was at the club. He loved his time in Blackburn and played there for 2 seasons, wanted to play there for a third, but sadly, the club weren't willing to do that because their financial situation just wasn't really the best. And so that sort of segues into the fact that some supposedly unpopular decisions have to be made at times. Now, let this not, at the risk of sounding political, let this not be a justification for Keir Starmer's scandalous, disgusting decision to scrap the winter payments, because that is just downright cruel. And I'm sorry for making this a political broadcast, but that is, what I feel about it. But in some cases, clubs will have to take things into consideration, and the better they come into effect. I'm pretty certain that when Aston Villa were doing so well and were in that race for the Champions League, they were thinking a lot about all of this. And obviously PSR came in late on in the season, sort of around season's end, and pretty much, meant that they had to really, really work hard.
Of course, PSR needs to be replaced, and I think Richard Masters, Kate, needs to do something about it, or really it should be a successor. We can't have clubs spending ridiculous amounts like Bury and Bolton Wanderers, and you go further down the leagues. You look at the likes of Reading, you look at Wigan, you look at Derby County and Sheffield Wednesday. I've named those teams, those 4 teams in particular, because a Premier League team looks like it's going to do just what those teams have done. And I think it is completely wrong and against every single rule in the book. But we can't have that. So something's got to be put in place, but it needs to be fairer. It needs to be fairer, because Manchester City, you can't knock them off their perch now. They're stuck there, unless they do something with these 115 charges. You look at other clubs that have bought their way in there, Chelsea, the big one, and we'll come on to that. So what actually is the answer in your eyes, Kate?
Well, it has to be 0 starting point for everybody. So as far as I'm concerned, at the moment, the existing PSR setup, Man City and Chelsea in particular, because they'd already got the funds into the clubs, they were already 100 points ahead of everybody else because you've got the money in there. So I think that everybody needs to start at 0. And I think these rules that have been muted about you're only allowed to spend, or whatever the restriction was, on the lowest club in the division based on their turnover and their income. I don't know what variable you'd attach it to, but it has to be equal. And I don't think something like a wage cap would necessarily change things. I think the horse has bolted long ago for us to put any kind of wage cap in place, but a lot of these contracts need to be torn up. Some of the contracts and the legalities around some of the contracts, like Manny said a really good point about, these minimum appearances and that kind of thing. Players end up sitting on the bench because the club can't play them because it costs too much money, and that's absolutely insane. If that's a great player on the bench that can get you into Europe or can save you from relegation or can win you the title of your division, that's just so against what football's about. So it has to encompass everything. It can't just be in isolation. It can't be a set of rules in isolation. It has to be linked, I think, probably fairly to the bottom club in the division, and it has to also incorporate probably a new set of legislation for footballers' contracts. I hate the transfer window. I absolutely hate it. All it does every single time is go to the last week, normally the last day. You probably got an Odin Wingy situation where some player's driven somewhere to get his transfer done.
Yeah.
And then people just say, sod it, we've got 3 hours left, I'll pay the 50 million rather than 30. That's not right. It's almost like a gambling, I've come this far, so I'll plug the money in, like the Oasis ticket situation last week. It's the same kind of mentality where money just flies around because the deadlines are fast approaching. And that doesn't make it right. And the transfer window is an absolute mess because of it. Players should be able to move whenever they want. It's a job. As long as you work your notice or have that built into your contract, you should be able to move when you goddamn like. I don't care. So it all needs looking at: players' contracts, the Bosman ruling, whilst it's great, I had a friend years ago who played for Hereford, and the Bosman ruling was great because he was free to go, but then at the same time it screwed him because as a lower league player he was frozen out by his existing manager and couldn't play for basically the whole season, and he was only on like say 40 grand a year, so he wasn't playing football on a really basic salary where a lot of that was attached to appearances. So he was living on the breadline and couldn't move because he was in contract. Yeah. So the Bosman ruling needs looking at because we have a Yuri Tillman situation, or we have that lower league situation where it screws players who are not on a lot of money. The whole thing's almost broken, and it's a real shame, and it's such a telling situation now that you're doing a show like this to talk about what's going off the field rather about what's going on it.
Yeah,
it's really sad, and it's more that that's what people are talking about even more. Like I've seen Man United today have lost 113 million in the year. That's what's been released today, 113 million. But everybody who will read that will not feel half the venom towards that they have done Leicester. I guarantee it. Because you just accept that they'll get away with it. Oh, it's Man United though.
But it's ridiculous, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, Manchester United have lost that ridiculous amount of money, and Leicester, I don't think it's probably anywhere near that, and they're stinging the smaller clubs. Another thing I wanted to bring up with you, and I don't know if Manny, has your internet connection caught back up?
Can you hear me now, though?
Yeah,
can you hear me
now? Yeah, we can hear you now.
Not brilliant quality though.
Well, one thing I did want to mention, and why I said,
this is what happens when your PC is out of commission. You have to use your mobile.
No, that's all right, mate. No problem. Of course, I did mention there Reading, Wigan, Sheffield Wednesday, Derby. Now, there's a common theme between those teams, and Chelsea, if it's being reported correctly, are just about to do the same. And that is to sell the ground to the owner. Now, one thing that is also comparable between all those clubs is that they're all financially broken. Every single one. Bolton's another one. And I think it is completely wrong that they are selling an asset like that to themselves to actually then fund the club, because when they want to pull out the club, a club is then fragmented, and I think it's frightening, these teams trying to get around it. Now, if a smaller club, say for example we did that, that's quite frightening if it's not all kept within one, because already Dean Court is sold to Shropshire Dean. We had to sell that, but the problem is a lot of these big clubs are going to do that to try and get around these rules, aren't they?
Is that to me or to Manny?
Absolutely,
Manny. Yeah, go for it, Manny.
Yeah. So if you can hear me now, obviously, I'm glad that Kate pretty much touched on my point on how sometimes these smaller clubs are now going to have to try to look at all of these issues regarding players' bonuses and salaries and so forth. The better they get, they're just going to have to sort of work by the seat of their trousers throughout the season, and I'm sure that's what Aston Villa pretty much did. And to answer your question about the dream scenario with Bournemouth, hopefully you lot will do really well, but the issue of bonuses will be properly negotiated as and when the season takes place. And I think there may be some clauses as well where sometimes bonuses might have to be decreased with an added proviso that maybe they could be provided over the course of time. But the most important thing is that payments have to be made regularly and in time. And another bit, we had a points deduction. I think our dear friend Eugene will remember this. In the mid-90s, Spurs were also deducted 12 points for the 93-94 season because they were found to have made irregular payments to their players. And at the time, Alan Sugar was chairman of the club. I believe on appeal it was halved to 6, but it did, of course, make a big difference to them, as they missed out on qualifying for Europe despite having had a very good season. And of course, that was the season where, Solskjaer, Jeremiah Campbell emerged as a potential defender of repute, and a certain Jurgen Klinsmann joined the club and was scoring goals for fun. So those are things that are going to have to be considered. And as for the question of the smaller clubs in question and some other clubs, as you mentioned, selling grounds to their owners, you're absolutely spot on. That is a bit of a slippery slope in some respects, and it's kind of sad that clubs have to sort of take that that sort of a drastic decision. And it just goes to show that when you put a lot of resources into trying to build a stadium, trying to build a dream, and seeing that dream not quite come to fruition, the financial ramifications will be essentially huge. And even though you might want to try to play your way around that by selling the ground to the owner, you're asking for some trouble in a way. Even with Arsenal as well, when Stan Kroenke bought his stake in our club, it did in many ways help in alleviating a lot of the debts that we had incurred in the move from Highbury to Ashburton Grove, now of course the Emirates Stadium. And at least in some cases we're in somewhat better financial health, although our pretty abysmal transfer business, where we spend a lot more than we raise in terms of revenues from sales, I think that might also put us in a little bit of trouble at times. I'm at least grateful that we got money for the likes of Eddie Nketiah and Aaron Ramsdale to some extent. But this little thing where you're talking about clubs selling the stadia to their owners, it's a reminder of of the desperate times that these clubs are under. And this is going to be one of those examples where fans from the community are going to have to try to chip in and maybe possibly consider the concept of fan ownership. And I think history has shown that it has in some ways saved a few clubs in a way. I think Wimbledon might be an example. I don't know.
We were.
But now the fans
we had to sell.
But now the fans are going to have to be more. Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that. And so the fans are now going to have to be more invested in their club than ever as a means of trying to save everything. And if they can, it's almost as if they're going to have to arrange a kind of a GoFundMe just to save a club from financial ruin. And that shouldn't be the case, but that is the situation where we're at right now. And these clubs do have big histories. Wigan were FA Cup winners not too long ago, don't forget.
But Chelsea feel they're selling their ground to their owner to get round these rules. And I just think that's completely wrong. But taking it back to Leicester and, of course, the other 13 clubs, I was shocked when there was some people out there, and the likes of Simon Jordan, who, of course, was chairman of Crystal Palace for a long period of time, that other fans of the other 13 clubs were just dismayed, because I think it's a great thing that Leicester have shown the Premier League up, and hopefully fans, once Richard Masters goes and PSR goes, can start to dream again that could happen, because I think it could do eventually, but we have to wait until Manchester City, of course, players will, get older and they will, leave the club, but we're going to have to wait some time. And I'm just shocked that, the other 13 clubs, fans of other 13 clubs, were a bit like, well, they should have been punished for it. Don't you think, Kate?
Yeah, I think, you're right. I was quite shocked that people aren't seeing it as a bit of a fight for the normal football club on the street, because that's exactly what it is. And like I've just said, I think the mainstream media have a lot to do with this, and what we have now accepted in the last decade or so, more so, of Premier League football, that the top six are just untouchable. And over the course of a long period, we have been told by a lot of the media a lot of how the results go, a lot of how Champions Leagues go, a lot of Man City winning everything. I mean, when you do a prediction league or a score prediction for Man City, you often put a 4 at the front, right? Because you're just used to them trouncing everybody. And that way of thinking is etched into people's heads. So when, like I've said, I reckon the noise that came from those 13 clubs about Leicester's breach, there will be no way near as much noise about Man United's breach. Because it's how you've been ingrained over the last 10 years to think, well, but Leicester aren't welcome. What are Leicester do? What do Leicester think they are? Like, whereas Man United, it's like, oh, well, Man United, isn't it? There's just an acceptance. And that's where it gets me mad, because people like you, people like me, don't get me wrong, Leicester messed up big time. We had 116% of our turnover was on wages. That's unacceptable. I don't know who's agreed that and signed that off. That is not a good business model, but you gamble a bit in football to think that better days are ahead. So there was perhaps some method in the madness, but 116% of your turnover on wages is flipping ridiculous. So that with Leicester they've made some errors for sure, but I don't get this sort of hate towards us. I don't know whether it's historically because we had money problems in the past 20 or so years ago. I'm not quite sure what it is, or is it just that people have been so ingrained and taught by the powers that be that you're just not welcome, and who do you think you are? And if people actually ask themselves that question, why are they so angry? It would be interesting to hear what they really, really think, because everyone's just rolling their eyes at the 115 charges with Man City now, like we all are. There'll be 115 appeals off the back of it for sure. Man City might be a bit different because I think it's about accounting irregularities, which to me, and I'm only saying my opinion, that could be deemed to be fraudulent, which is a legal criminal issue. Leicester's was a breach of rules that we now know aren't even set in law. It's just football rules. They've not broken any law of England. So it's time to just rehash the whole lot really and go back to the basics of football. And money's just starting to really creep into the terraces now, and that's not why we started watching football, is it?
No, completely agree. And it's getting more and more expensive for the fans, and clubs, and of course we was talking about this as well beforehand, which is gambling sponsors. It's now kind of a necessity. Don't get me wrong, our gambling sponsors on the front of our shirts are firstly, the name is absolutely terrible, but there's supposedly a lot of connotations behind what they also do as well. Gambling in countries where it isn't legal, but it is kind of a necessity, and it's just ruining football.
They pay the money. What are you going to do?
What happens when this ban comes in? Is it going to be a case of, well, the top six are fine, because they've all got, sponsors, and they're big enough, and they've, their legacy is
up in some way, aren't they?
Yeah, they've built themselves up. Man City, they had none of this when they were building themselves up. Same for Chelsea. But no club can actually do that. And what are they going to do? So the gambling sponsors all pull their money out, and you've then got 14 clubs on points deductions. Where does it end? And it just feels like, even though they say that, they don't, and the fans don't want it, these top six clubs, without a shadow of a doubt, it feels like it is slowly edging towards that European Super League, doesn't it really, Kate?
Yeah, it does. That's kind of what they've started to create, isn't it? That's what these rules are almost designed to do, that there's a very elite exclusive table that has only got 6 seats, it would seem. And if you're not going to let us literally create a Super League, then we'll try and create a framework where we virtually do it anyway. So there's it's becoming almost 3 leagues in the Premier League, isn't it? The top 6 is like, it's boring unless you're one of the supporters of those top 6. Then you've got the other European spots, maybe down to 10th or 11th, and then the rest, which I think 12 to 20 will be in a relegation scrap this year. And if you string 3 wins together on the bounce, you're safe, and that will be basically it. But I'd like to hear Manny's point as well, because another thing that you said about the selling of the hotels there was also we've done this recently. So we sold Kiernan Dewsbury Hall to Chelsea.
Yeah.
And despite what fans say, I think he did want to go because you can't turn that kind of opportunity down. But there was perhaps an also financial reward in that he was a homegrown player. It's fully profitable. And it was 35 million quid or 40 that we couldn't afford to turn down to keep us within the rules this year. However, it'd be interesting to see your views on this, that in return, we got a young lad called Michael Golding from Chelsea, who's 18, and we paid £5 million to Chelsea at the same time to go the other way, because they obviously need to knock 5 million quid off instantly from a homegrown player. I don't think Leicester were ever interested in Michael Golding. I don't think he's not even featured on the bench or anything yet. So I think that's been done from a financial point of view.
Yeah.
And for me, as a sport lover, and I used to do sport to a fairly decent level myself, that isn't fair on the lad. You want him to go to a club or stay at his home club to be able to progress his career, not just be part of a financial transaction so that your home club don't get done for PSR, go into a club that doesn't really want you and you're going to sit in isolation. And that's a really sad part of the situation as well, that there's no one club players anymore. Kiernan perhaps would have been a one club player, maybe. Yeah. But also these young lads that are being used. I think Everton and Villa did it as well. There was
Everton, Villa and Newcastle. It was kind of like a trio, wasn't it?
Kids that are waiting to pursue their dreams and you're being used as a financial pawn, and it's actually really quite vulgar. There's something I don't like about that. They're not a trade. They're kids that want to make their way in the world. And I just feel that that's another really sad, important point of these horrendous rules, really.
And I think, you could look at, say, for example, take myself back to when I was 18, and I wanted to play for Bournemouth. And then all of a sudden, because of the fact that somebody needs, they need to do some sort of thing with the accounting, which, to be honest, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand all the rules. There's so many, I don't understand all the rules. I am then sold off to Aston Villa, for example. So I've had to move up to Birmingham. I wanted to spend a career in Bournemouth, but then somebody who's in Birmingham, Aston Villa, gets sent down to Bournemouth. They don't want to be down in Bournemouth. They wanted to play for Aston Villa. They've supported the team all their life, for example. And I completely agree. It's creating these sort of scenarios now.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting Manny's point of view on that, because I just, from the contract point of view, it's probably going to be quite lucrative for the lads because they'll get a professional contract from a Premier League club. But I just think it's probably going to be more often than not to severe detriment to their career, really. That's how I see it.
What do you reckon, Manny?
Yeah, obviously, I'm really glad that Kate offered to segue into me and get my views on this. Obviously, one big example, of course, is when we sold Emiliano Martinez. Now, after that season in 2020 where we won the FA Cup and recovered from a dreadful season where we lost Unai Emery midway and Mikel Arteta came in and had to try to steer the ship somewhat, we weren't expected to get much out of it. And we finished 8th in the Premiership and had an embarrassing exit from Europe. But Martinez was one of the key players, along with Aubameyang and a few others, who helped us win the FA Cup. And I wanted him to stay and become our first choice goalkeeper. But a lot of people are saying that when Aston Villa made the offer to us to take him off our hands for 20 million quid, and none was forthcoming for Bernd Leno, that might have been the catalyst for Arteta to decide to get rid of Martinez and keep Leno, because we spent quite a bit of money getting him from Germany to come and play for us. But it was a decision that angered me in many ways, because I'm old-fashioned and I believe that, if you work hard to earn your place in the team on merit, you deserve to be there. And if it's true that Arteta's decision to, not make Emi the first choice the following season was based on financial reasons, then that makes it all the more stupid, because we've spent we spent a ridiculous amount of money trying to, get some goalkeepers who've come in. none of whom have really, convinced. And the jury is still out on David Raya, notwithstanding the fact that he won the Golden Gloves Award last season. He still has quite a few deficiencies, in my opinion. But without digressing, that's an example of how sometimes financial situations can, dictate that certain players who might not want to leave a club would end up having to go. But the move works out beautifully for Emmy. He's a hero in Birmingham, and of course, if he hadn't have joined Aston Villa to play regularly, he wouldn't have had any chance of earning the success he did with Argentina. But ideally, we would have kept him in. We would have made him the number one and put Leno on the transfer market. And I'm sure there would have been some clubs who would have come in for him. And this little bit about, younger players, as Kate has said, being used as make weights in any kind of potential transfer deals, it is sadly a fact of it. And we might even be in a situation where we will have to, get rid of a few of our young players ourselves. We've seen Amari Hutchinson move to Chelsea, and then he's now, of course, moved on to Ipswich, but at least he's getting some game time. And whether or not some of these younger players will get game time at their new clubs will, of course, be to the discretion of the manager. And, of course, if some of these players, do well in training and are lucky enough to catch the manager's eye, they might actually end up, playing a few games and actually making a bit of a career out of it. So, as Dido Armstrong would say, it wouldn't be so bad at all, I suppose. It's not really a nice situation. You don't want to play with the hopes and dreams of these youngsters who've grown up supporting a club. But it just goes to show that at the end of the day, when it comes to, cold, hard decisions for the sake of a club and also for the sake of a career, loyalty, love, and feelings just, can't really come into it. And sometimes tough financial decisions will have to be made. I didn't agree with the decision to get rid of Emi Martinez, and now there are some younger players at our club. I think Kozia Dewberry has left the club to go somewhere else. If Ethan Nwaneri doesn't get any games, he might also look to want to be on the move. And maybe there are these machinations going on, which are being done to a higher effect of trying to get some better players in. But again, it's also going to be about the issue of salaries. And when you live in a city like London or Manchester, where the costs of living are definitely not low, you can't have salary caps at these big clubs. I was talking about this with another mate of mine who happens to have a YouTube channel of his own, a wonderful YouTube channel, I might add. Warren's Team Talk, let me shout him out. He'd be, if you can do a stream with him, that would be terrific, Craig. He told me that if you have a salary cap at some of these bigger clubs, you are not going to attract these players, and you'll have a situation where more of your better players will end up going to countries like Saudi Arabia, which will offer these obscene salaries. And I was also just now reading an article about the Bosman ruling, which meant that although players got more freedom, it also meant that certain clubs had to tie down their star assets to the club by offering them long-term contracts with high salaries. And we did something similar with the likes of, Mesut Ozil, Aubameyang, offering them those ridiculous salaries every single week. And then we ended up letting Aubameyang go away for literally nothing. So again, there has to be some common sense with regard to the internal dealings. And when you sign up on a free transfer, you also have to accept that he can, in some ways, command salaries. You didn't have to pay a sign-on fee to get him into the club in the first place. And so invariably, you're going to have a situation where in order to make some of these transfers happen to improve the team, you will have to sacrifice a few of the youngsters by sending them out on these deals as make weights for the transfer. It's not an ideal situation for the player in question. I completely agree. But sadly, that is more or less the way it is. And I think we can all agree that if football clubs improve their internal working and improve their internal financial operations and become a better run club, the game will be better off. And that is why I think clubs must be subjected to compulsory audits either midway through the season or at least near the end or somewhere near the beginning, at least once a season, preferably twice, to make sure that everything is in order. And when you have these audits being done, if there are more audits done in the season, then clubs just can't be in a situation where they can, cook the books and make everything all rosy to avoid getting punished. Everything is going to have to be reported, and everything is going to have to be done according to the accounting rules that are in place at the time. But I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if the Premier League are going to want to see a lot more regulation being brought in. I don't know if they will want to see that thing, see what they've created become subject to that level of, bureaucracy. All we can do is just hope that things will get better. And yet, I don't know if there's any real hope of that happening, at least not soon.
Well,
does any of that make sense to you?
To be honest, it does make sense. It does make sense. I think it's probably best to close on that point, because I think I think football has got a big problem, and hopefully, fingers crossed, because I do like Leicester as a club, and I'd love to see you stay up this season. I think it would have been, well, with a 9-point deduction. I always said before that it had to happen before the season started, and I said that with Chris as well. I said it had to happen before, that they left it so late. Of course, it was only last week, wasn't it? That it was announced. I just think it's all just wrong. So, yeah, hopefully.
The cynic in me, though, which again is me being cynical and only my opinion, but we were told, or rumoured were, that the decision was going to come in the new year because Man City's case was going to come first, and they were finally putting that at the top of the list. So the cynic in me was like, it's happened 3 days after the transfer window's closed.
Yeah.
How flipping interesting. Or is that just me being too cynical? Because we were trying to behave ourselves in the transfer window, and I think we did.
To be honest, I think, I think it's completely legit. I think, at the end of the day, Richard Masters and the Premier League hierarchy and the EFL to certain points as well are a complete mess. Complete mess. And there needs to be some sort of rules, some governing bodies, something to actually, you don't want a club, spending so much money, and like we saw Leeds United all those years ago, spend loads and loads and loads of money and put themselves in danger. We don't want that. But we don't want clubs being punished when they're not in danger anyway. Everton maybe is a little bit of an exception because they are in a bit of a perilous position. It's fair to say, but
just you can't. What's the phrase? You can treat them all equally, but you can't treat them the same. There's going to be extenuating circumstances for every single club, and Man City will be included in that for sure. But the final point from me on the whole PSR thing is you almost have to have eyes in the back of your head. So we were in line to sign a Leverkusen striker, Adam Hlocek, who's a 22-year-old apparent superstar. And right at the 11th hour, when apparently agreed the transfer fee, but at the 11th hour, he decided not to come. And that was all because Rutter went to Brighton. Because that part of that fee went to Hoffenheim, that gave Hoffenheim the money to offer Hlocek more and offer Leverkusen more. So he went to Hoffenheim because Rutter went to Brighton. Now, what the hell? That is just a game of chess now, and you have to have eyes in the back of your head. And that's just mental.
It's just ruining football, isn't it? But Kate, thank you so much for coming on and joining me. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get you back on very, very soon.
Yeah, sure. Let me know. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And good to meet. Well, not quite meet you, Manny, but good to see you. Not see you either.
Likewise, Kate. Likewise. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure.
Not a problem at all, Manny, and I'm sure we'll do this again very, very soon. Thank you so much for coming on. Even though I know there's been some technical issues, but hopefully everything will get itself sorted out for you.
And hopefully today we've made it work. I mean, obviously, it wasn't ideal, me going off a little bit every now and then, and I've had to sort of adjust everything, but I think I found a way to make it work. And I'm going to try and make sure this doesn't become a regular thing. I love coming on the channel, whether it's for cherry picking or this is football, and I hope to keep coming again, obviously. And I'm glad I was able to do this, because this is not your run-of-the-mill stream. We were talking about one of the big issues today, and it was a wonderful pleasure to meet Kate as well and speak to her and offer my, 2 pence worth on this. And
ditto.
it's always a pleasure, and I'm glad it worked out in the end.
Well, you're always welcome, Manny. Honestly, don't worry about it. It happens. There's been times when my internet's gone down, and I don't know if you remember that stream. Oh, when was it? It was last year, and the whole lighting just disappeared. Absolutely disappeared. I just was descending into darkness in the middle of it. It was live as well, and hey, it happens. But no, thank you so much, both of you. And Kate, I'm sure that we'll catch up before the game at the King Power.
Yes.
Which is coming up on the 5th, isn't it? The 5th
Yeah,
of
the 5th of October. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Excellent stuff. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit the bell button. Go over to Leicester Till I Die. Go and subscribe there as well. Chris will be happy. And we'll see you in the next one. Thank you for joining us.
The TalkSport Fan Network.
The ultimate on-demand destination for the UK's best fan-led football podcasts.
Want authentic supporter insight on all things Bournemouth? Follow Up the Cherries in all departments on the TalkSport Fan Network.
Club-dedicated content created by the fans, for the fans.
Search TalkSport Fan Network.